this story might change the way you think. Because what I'm about to tell you happened at the most expensive wedding of the year, in front of 300 guests, under crystal chandeliers worth more than most people's homes. A woman in a red dress raised her hand against a girl who couldn't fight back. And when the groom walked in and saw it, nobody in that ballroom expected what he would say. Just one sentence. That's all it took. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why that one sentence became the most talked about moment in the city that year. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and which country you belong to. Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far this community reaches. Today's story is one of the most emotional and powerful ones I've shared in a long time. It's about power, about cruelty hiding behind beauty, and about a man who had to choose between the life he built and the person he was raised to be. I won't tell you how it ends. I'll just say, stay with me until the last section because it will heal something in you. Let's begin. Nobody in that ballroom thought the night would end in silence. The Ashford estate in Charleston, South Carolina had never seen a wedding like this one. White orchids flown in from 3 continents. A live orchestra tuning their instruments in the East Wing. Waitstaff in black and gold moving like shadows between round tables draped in ivory silk. This was the wedding of Daniel Whitfield, 34 years old, the man behind Whitfield Capital, a private equity empire worth $11 billion. Forbes had called him the quiet billionaire. A man who built his fortune without ever giving a single interview, who avoided cameras the way other men avoided taxes. Tonight, he was marrying Vanessa Cole. Vanessa was beautiful in the way magazine covers are beautiful. Sharp cheekbones, a laugh that carried across rooms, a wardrobe that made stylists nervous. She came from old Charleston money, the kind of family whose name was etched into hospital wings and university libraries. To the outside world, Daniel and Vanessa looked like the perfect match. 2 empires joining hands. But Daniel wasn't in the ballroom yet. He was upstairs in a private study lined with his late father's law books, finishing a phone call about a hospital wing he was funding anonymously in Detroit, the same city he grew up in, 3 blocks from a shelter that once gave his mother and him a place to sleep when he was 9 years old. Nobody at this wedding knew that story. Vanessa didn't know it either. Not really. She knew the sanitized version, self-made, humble beginnings, words that sound good in engagement announcements but hide the truth underneath them. Downstairs, in the service corridor behind the kitchen, a 22-year-old woman named Amara Johnson was refilling a tray of champagne glasses. She had been hired 3 weeks earlier through a staffing agency, one of 40 temporary workers brought in for the event. Amara was in her last semester of nursing school at a community college outside Charleston, working 2 jobs to pay for it. Catering paid better than most, and weddings like this one paid the best of all, if you didn't mind 12-hour shifts on your feet in dress shoes that didn't fit right. She had no idea, walking into that kitchen with a tray balanced on one arm, that her life was about to collide with people whose world was built to never even notice hers. Started small. A spilled drop of champagne on the hem of Vanessa's wedding gown. $140,000 custom Vera Wang, hand-beaded, flown in from New York 2 days earlier. Amara had turned a corner too fast, tray tilting, and one single drop landed on white silk. It was barely visible. Beck. The kind of thing a dry cleaner could handle in an afternoon. But Vanessa Cole did not see a speck. She saw in that instant every fear she had been carrying for months, that this wedding, this day, needed to be flawless, needed to prove something to 300 guests who whispered behind manicured hands about whether a quiet billionaire, like Daniel Whitfield, was even capable of real love, or whether this was simply a merger with a ring attached. Vanessa needed today to be perfect. And in her mind, in that white-hot second, Amara had ruined it. Do you know what this dress cost? Vanessa's voice cracked across the corridor, sharp enough that 2 other staff members froze mid-step. Amara immediately set down the tray. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. Let me get a cloth I can." "You people," Vanessa said, and something shifted in her face. Something that had nothing to do with a champagne stain and everything to do with a woman who had spent her whole life being told she was better than people who worked with their hands. You people don't understand what it takes to build something like this. A crowd was starting to gather at the edge of the corridor. Guests drifting from the cocktail hour, drawn by raised voices the way people are always drawn to conflict they can watch from a safe distance. Amara's hands were shaking now, but she kept her voice steady. "Ma'am, it was an accident. I can call the dry cleaner right now, they can." That's when someone, later no one could agree who, handed Vanessa a riding crop that had been part of an equestrian-themed photo display near the garden entrance, decorative, meant for pictures. Vanessa's fingers closed around it. And the room went quiet in the worst possible way. What happened in the next 60 seconds would be talked about in Charleston for years. Vanessa raised the crop. Amara instinctively turned away, pressing herself against the corridor wall, arms crossing over her face. The first strike landed across her shoulder blade. A gasp rippled through the gathering crowd, the kind of collective sound people make when they know they should intervene but freeze instead, waiting for someone else to move first. "Vanessa, stop." A woman's voice, one of the bridesmaids, but it came too late and too soft to matter. The second strike came before anyone could reach her. Amara didn't scream. She just pressed her face harder into her forearm, tears streaming silently. Her body curling smaller against the wall like she was trying to disappear into it. 22 years old, 3 semesters from becoming a nurse, and in this moment, in front of 300 strangers in designer gowns and tuxedos, she was being treated like she was less than human. Guests had their phones out now. Not to help. Film. That's the part that would haunt people later. Not just what Vanessa did, but how many people simply watched, cocktail glasses still in hand, filming instead of stepping between a grown woman and a young girl who had done nothing but spill a drop of champagne. It was the sound of footsteps, fast, heavy, deliberate, that finally broke the paralysis in that hallway. Daniel Whitfield had heard the commotion from the top of the stairs. He didn't know what it was at first. Just raised voices, the kind that didn't belong at his wedding. But something in his chest told him to move before his mind had even processed why. He took the stairs 2 at a time, rounded the corner into the service corridor and stopped. He saw his fiancée in her wedding dress, riding crop raised for a third strike. He saw a young woman pressed against the wall, shoulders shaking, a red welt already rising on pale brown skin visible where her uniform had shifted. He saw 30 phones raised, recording. And for one full second, a second that felt, to everyone watching, like it stretched into an hour, Daniel Whitfield said nothing at all. Vanessa turned, breathless, crop still in her hand, and for just a flicker of a moment, something like relief crossed her face. The assumption, the certainty, that her husband-to-be would stand beside her, would understand, would tell the staff to handle this discreetly and usher the guests back to cocktail hour like nothing had happened. That was how their world worked. Money smoothed things over. Money always had. "Daniel," she said, straightening, already reaching for the version of the story she would tell him later, the one where she was justified, where the girl had ruined her dress, where anyone in her position would have reacted the same way. "This girl ruined my dress. I was just." Daniel crossed the corridor in 4 long strides. He didn't look at Vanessa. He knelt down in front of Amara, who flinched at the sudden movement beside her, still shielding her face. His voice, when it came, was quiet. Quiet enough that the entire hallway had to hold its breath to hear it. "You're safe now," he said to her. "I've got you." Then he stood, turned to Vanessa, and every phone in that hallway caught what happened next. He looked at the woman he was supposed to marry in 40 minutes, looked at the crop still in her hand, looked at the 300 guests frozen mid-witness, and said the sentence that would end up on the local news, on national talk shows, on every corner of the internet within 72 hours. "The wedding is off, and so is everything you thought you knew about who I really am." The room didn't just go silent. It went still, the way air goes still before a storm breaks. Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed. Daniel, you're overreacting. She's staff, she's replaceable, this is. Don't, Daniel said. Just one word. But it carried a weight that made even the string quartet in the next room, who could hear the commotion through the walls, stop mid-note. He turned back to Amara, who was still trembling against the wall, and gently helped her stand upright. "What's your name?" he asked her softly, like there weren't 300 people watching. Amara," she managed. "Amara Johnson." "Amara," he repeated like he was memorizing it. "I'm going to make sure you're okay. I promise you that." And then came the twist that nobody in that hallway, not the guests, not the staff, not even Vanessa, saw coming. Daniel turned to face the crowd. His voice steady but carrying now, meant for every person in that corridor to hear. 25 years ago, he said, I was 9 years old, living in a homeless shelter in Detroit with my mother. We had nothing. Not a home, not a car, not even a guarantee of dinner most nights. My mother cleaned houses. Big houses like this one. Houses full of people who looked at her the exact same way Vanessa just looked at Amara. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Quiet ones, the kind people try to suppress out of politeness even when they're stunned. "I remember," Daniel continued, "a woman my mother worked for backhanding her across the face because she'd folded a sweater the wrong way. I remember being 9 years old and not being able to do a single thing about it. I promised myself that day that if I ever had power, real power, the kind that could actually protect people, I would never ever stand by and watch it happen to someone else." He looked at Vanessa now, and his voice cracked just slightly with something between grief and fury. "I built Whitfield Capital so that no one who works for me would ever be treated the way my mother was treated. I have policies, real policies, not PR, protecting every single person on every project, every event, every company under my name. And you," he said to Vanessa, "just violated every single one of them in front of 300 witnesses at our own wedding." Vanessa's face had gone white. "Daniel, I didn't know. You never told me about your mother, about any of this." "That's exactly the problem," Daniel said quietly. "In 2 years together, you never once asked." He turned back to Amara. "I'm going to make sure you get medical attention right now, and I'm covering every cost. The semester you have left, tuition, everything. This isn't charity. This is what should have happened for my mother, and didn't." Amara, still shaking, could barely speak. "You don't have to do that, sir, I know I don't have to," Daniel said. "I want to." He turned to the wedding planner, standing frozen near the kitchen entrance, phone still in her hand from an earlier logistics call. "Please call an ambulance for a welfare check, and get Ms. Johnson somewhere private and comfortable. Everyone else." He raised his voice to address the full ballroom now, guests spilling in from the reception hall, drawn by the commotion. "The wedding is cancelled. I'm sorry for the disruption to your evening. Dinner and the open bar will continue on me, for as long as you'd like to stay. But there will be no ceremony tonight." He didn't wait for Vanessa's response. He didn't storm off dramatically either. He simply knelt beside Amara again, offering his arm to steady her, and walked her out of that corridor himself, past 300 stunned faces, past a woman in a $140,000 dress standing utterly alone for the first time in her adult life. The video was uploaded within the hour. By midnight it had 2 million views. By morning it had 30 million. News outlets picked it up by breakfast. CNN, local Charleston affiliates, entertainment blogs, and finance publications that had spent years trying and failing to get even a single quote from the notoriously private Daniel Whitfield. Now his face was everywhere, and so was hers. Vanessa Cole, riding crop raised, captured from 4 different angles by 4 different phones. But something unexpected happened in the days that followed. The story didn't stay a scandal. It became something else entirely. Reporters dug into Daniel's past, and what they found surprised even the most cynical among them. The Detroit shelter he mentioned, Hope Harbor, was real, and records showed Whitfield Capital had been its largest anonymous donor for the past 9 years, funding a full renovation 2 years earlier that nobody had ever traced back to him. A pediatric wing at a Detroit hospital, opened 18 months prior under a donor name that turned out to be an obscure legal entity owned by Daniel personally. A scholarship fund for first-generation nursing students at 3 community colleges across South Carolina, quietly running for 4 years, that, reporters realized with a jolt, Amara Johnson had actually applied to and been rejected from twice, due to funding limits, before finally being accepted the previous fall. Daniel Whitfield hadn't built a persona. He'd built a life around a promise he made to a scared 9-year-old boy watching his mother get humiliated for a living. He simply never talked about it because to him it was never about credit. It was about the promise. Amara, meanwhile, was recovering. Physically, the welts would fade within 2 weeks. The doctors confirmed nothing was seriously injured. But emotionally, she was overwhelmed in a different way entirely. Message requests flooded her social media from strangers around the country. Some offering support, some offering money. Some simply saying thank you for staying strong in that hallway. Nursing students from her program reached out. A woman in Ohio wrote to say she'd been in a similar situation years earlier, working as a housekeeper, and had never had anyone stand up for her, and that watching the video had made her cry for reasons she still couldn't fully explain. Vanessa Cole, on the other hand, disappeared from public view almost entirely. Her family's foundation issued a brief statement expressing deep regret over the incident. 2 corporate sponsorships tied to her name were quietly dropped within the week. It wasn't Daniel's wealth or reach that ended things for her. It was simply 30 million people watching 30 seconds of who she really was, unfiltered, unrehearsed, in a moment she thought no consequences would ever follow her out of that hallway. Daniel didn't comment on any of it publicly beyond the words he'd already said. He didn't do interviews. He didn't post a follow-up statement. Instead, 3 days after the wedding that never happened, he did something quieter, something that never made headlines the way the confrontation had. He personally visited Amara at her small apartment near the community college, not with cameras, not with lawyers, just him in jeans and a plain jacket, carrying a folder. "I wanted to bring you this myself," he said, handing it to her. Inside was a full scholarship, not just for the remaining semester, but for her entire nursing degree, plus a stipend to cover rent and living expenses so she could quit her second job and focus fully on her studies. There was also a letter, handwritten, that Amara would later say she read so many times the creases wore soft. "You didn't do anything wrong that night," the letter read in part. "You did something that took more courage than most people ever show in their whole lives. You stayed standing even when you had every reason to fall. My mother never had someone walk into that room for her. Couldn't change that. But I could make sure it never happened to you." Amara, reading it on her small kitchen table, cried for the first time since the wedding. Not out of pain this time, but something that felt, for the first time in weeks, like relief. 6 months passed before the 2 of them spoke again in any meaningful way. Daniel had spent that time doing what he always did after major upheaval, retreating into work, though this time it was different work. He restructured the entire staffing and vendor protection policy across every Whitfield Capital-affiliated event, ensuring that any contract worker, caterer, or temporary staff member had direct legal protection and an anonymous reporting line straight to his own office, bypassing every layer of corporate hierarchy that might otherwise bury a complaint. He didn't announce it as a PR campaign. He just did it quietly, the same way he'd funded the shelter and the hospital wing for years without a single press release. Amara, meanwhile, had thrown herself fully into her studies for the first time without the crushing weight of 2 jobs pulling her in 3 directions. She made the dean's list that spring. She started volunteering at Hope Harbor, the very shelter Daniel had once slept in as a child, after learning, almost by accident, through a mutual acquaintance, about its history. It was there at Hope Harbor on a gray Tuesday afternoon in early spring that Daniel Whitfield walked in for his annual quiet visit. No cameras, no staff, Just him and a box of supplies he personally delivered every few months, and found Amara sitting on the floor of the children's reading room, surrounded by 6 kids, reading them a story in a soft, patient voice. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before she noticed him. "You volunteer here," he said when she finally looked up, more statement than question. "I found out this was your shelter," Amara said, standing, brushing off her jeans. "I wanted to see it for myself. Understand where all of this came from." They talked for 2 hours that afternoon, sitting on the shelter's worn front steps as the Detroit sky. She'd started making the 4-hour drive up on weekends when she could, turned orange and then gray. He told her more than he'd ever told a journalist, more than he'd told Vanessa in 2 years of dating. About his mother, who had passed away 6 years earlier, never quite escaping the exhaustion of decades of underpaid labor, never living to see her son's success translate into the kind of life she'd sacrificed everything trying to give him. About the guilt he still carried, the sense that his money had come 1 decade too late to save her from the world that had ground her down. Amara told him about her own mother, a home health aide in rural Georgia, still working 60-hour weeks at 58 years old, still telling Amara on every phone call to stand up straight and never let anybody make you feel small. Words Amara had repeated to herself silently in that hallway 6 months earlier, riding crop-raised inches from her face. "I think that's why I didn't run," Amara admitted quietly. "I wanted to. Every instinct told me to run. But my mother's voice was louder." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "That's the bravest thing I've ever heard anyone say." Neither of them called it anything at the time. It wasn't romantic, not yet. It was something quieter, something built on the strange, painful thread that had connected their 2 very different lives on one impossible night. A billionaire and a nursing student, bound together not by wealth or circumstance, but by 2 mothers who had both been underestimated by the world, and 2 children who had both promised themselves in very different ways to never let that happen to someone else again. The friendship, because that's what it remained, carefully, deliberately for a long time, grew slowly over the following year. Daniel funded a full renovation of Hope Harbor's nursing and health services wing, and asked Amara, still a student but already showing remarkable clinical instincts, to consult on the design. It wasn't a favor disguised as employment. He genuinely valued her insight, the same way he valued input from anyone who had actually lived the reality his money was trying to fix, rather than simply theorized about it from a boardroom. Amara graduated at the top of her class the following spring. Daniel attended the ceremony, sitting quietly in the back row. No entourage, no announcement, just a man in a modest gray suit who slipped out before the reception to avoid becoming the story of someone else's achievement. But Amara saw him leaving from across the parking lot, diploma still in hand, gown still on, and something in her chest told her to run after him. "You didn't have to come," she said, catching up to him by his car. "I wanted to," he said. "Same as always. You always slip out before anyone can thank you properly." "I'm not good at being thanked," Daniel admitted. "Never have been. When you grow up needing help and rarely getting it, and then suddenly you're the one who can give it, it's strange. Gratitude makes me uncomfortable in ways I still don't fully understand." Amara studied him for a moment, still in her cap and gown, diploma clutched against her chest, the culmination of a dream that had nearly been derailed by 2 rejected scholarship applications and a woman with a riding crop who never once considered what she was destroying. "Then let me say it just once," Amara said, "and you don't have to respond. You just have to hear it. Thank you. Not for the scholarship. For walking into that hallway. For kneeling down before you even looked at her. For choosing me, a stranger, over the life you were supposed to be living that night." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. The parking lot noise, distant applause still drifting from the auditorium, filled the space between them. "My mother used to say something," he finally said. "She said the truest measure of a person isn't how they treat people who can do something for them. It's how they treat people who can't." I spent my whole childhood watching her be treated like she didn't matter by people who had everything. I told myself if I ever had the power to be different, I would be. That night wasn't a hard decision, Amara. It was the easiest one I've ever made. They stood there for a while longer, the late afternoon sun catching the edge of her graduation gown. Two people who had been thrown together by cruelty and had somehow, slowly, built something honest out of it. It would be another 8 months before either of them acknowledged what had quietly grown between them was more than friendship. Neither wanted to rush it, both too aware of how quickly the world could distort something real into something performative, something for cameras rather than for each other. But those 8 months were filled with small things. Sunday phone calls that ran 2 hours long, Daniel showing up unannounced at the hospital where Amara had started her residency with coffee and exhausted patients during her hardest overnight shifts, Amara pushing back, gently but firmly, against Daniel's instinct to solve every problem with money instead of presence. "You can't buy your way into being needed," she told him once, only half joking. "Sometimes people just need you to sit with them." He never forgot that sentence. It became, in its own quiet way, the foundation of everything that came after. The proposal, when it finally came, happened nowhere near a ballroom. It happened at Hope Harbor, in the same reading room where Daniel had first found Amara sitting on the floor surrounded by children, nearly 2 years after that first conversation on the shelter steps. There were no chandeliers, no orchestra, no 300 guests with phones raised. Just Daniel, kneeling on the same worn carpet where he himself had once sat as a frightened 9-year-old, holding a ring that had belonged to his mother, the only piece of jewelry she'd owned, a thin gold band she'd kept hidden in a sock for years so it would never be pawned during the family's hardest months. "I know this isn't what you'd expect from someone with my resources," Daniel said, voice unsteady in a way Amara had rarely heard from him. "I could have taken you anywhere in the world for this. But I wanted to ask you here, in the one place that made me who I am, because you're the reason I finally feel at peace with that boy who used to sit on this floor feeling powerless. You gave me, something I didn't know I still needed. Not rescue. Partnership." Amara, crying before he'd even finished the sentence, said yes before he could formally ask the question. The wedding, when it happened 4 months later, looked almost nothing like the one that had ended before it began. It was small, 40 guests, held in the courtyard of Hope Harbor itself, catered not by a luxury service but by a rotating group of shelter staff and volunteers who insisted on cooking the meal themselves as their gift to the couple. Amara's mother flew in from Georgia, meeting Daniel for the first time and holding his face in both hands for a long moment before simply saying, "You take care of my daughter's heart the way she takes care of everyone else's." There was no press. No cameras beyond a single photographer, a family friend, hired specifically because she'd promised not to sell a single image. Daniel had learned, in the 2 years since that infamous video went viral, that the moments that mattered most rarely needed an audience to be real. But word got out anyway, not through leaked photos or paparazzi, but through Amara herself, who posted a single photo to her personal social media a week later. Her and Daniel standing outside Hope Harbor's front doors, her nursing badge still clipped to her dress beneath her wedding veil, a small tribute to the life he'd helped her build without ever asking for anything in return. The caption read simply, "2 years ago, a stranger knelt beside me in a hallway when he didn't have to. Today I married him." Some stories really do have second chances. It was reshared over 2 million times within a week. What people didn't expect, what became in its own way an even bigger story than the wedding itself, was what Daniel and Amara chose to do with their platform once the world's attention turned toward them again. Rather than retreating from the spotlight this time, they used it deliberately, carefully, in a way that felt true to who they both were. Amara, now a full-time nurse specializing in maternal health at a hospital in Charleston, partnered with Daniel to launch the Hope Harbor Workforce Protection Initiative, an organization dedicated to establishing legally binding protections for temporary, contract, and service workers across the hospitality and events industries nationwide, industries notorious for treating workers like Amara as disposable, invisible, replaceable. The initiative wasn't built around Daniel's wealth alone. It was built around Amara's insight, her understanding from the inside of exactly what it felt like to be underpaid, overworked, and unprotected in rooms full of people who assumed your humanity mattered less than their convenience. Within its first year, the initiative had successfully lobbied for stronger worker protection legislation in 3 states, funded free legal support for over 400 service workers facing mistreatment on the job, and established a national hotline, modeled after the internal reporting system Daniel had built for his own companies, that any hospitality or event worker in the country could call, day or night, if they experienced abuse on the job. Vanessa Cole, for her part, largely disappeared from public life in the years that followed, resurfacing only once, 18 months after the incident, in a brief, unguarded interview with a small regional paper. She didn't ask for sympathy. She simply said, when asked whether she had any regrets, "I spent my whole life being told that my comfort mattered more than other people's dignity. That night, in front of everyone, I finally saw what that belief looked like from the outside. I've spent every day since trying to understand how I became someone capable of that." It wasn't redemption exactly, but it was, for many who read it, an honest reckoning. Proof that even the person at the center of the video's worst moment was capable of growth, however painfully late it came. Daniel and Amara never spoke about her publicly again. They didn't need to. Their focus had long since moved past the scandal that first connected them, into something far more meaningful. A life built not around what had gone wrong that night, but around everything that had grown, slowly and honestly, from its wreckage. 3 years after that wedding that wasn't, Daniel and Amara welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Grace. A name Amara chose, quietly, because it was what she felt she'd been given in that hallway when a stranger knelt beside her instead of walking past. They raised her, from the very beginning, with a set of values neither of them had to negotiate, because they'd already lived the hard version of learning them. Grace grew up visiting Hope Harbor as naturally as other children visited grandparents' houses, learning early that some of the most important people in the world were the ones who never expected to be noticed. The shelter staff, the volunteers, the workers whose names never made headlines but whose quiet dedication held entire communities together. Amara continued nursing, eventually becoming head of maternal health at her hospital, mentoring a new generation of nursing students who came from backgrounds much like hers, working 2 jobs, stretched thin, uncertain whether their dreams were built to survive contact with reality. She made sure every single semester that at least one scholarship recipient from the Hope Harbor Fund had a direct line to her personally, not just paperwork and financial aid offices, but a real person who understood exactly what that late-night shift and early morning class schedule actually felt like from the inside. Daniel, for his part, never fully stepped back into the public, either way the world's fascination with his story might have invited him to. He gave one interview years later, not about the wedding, not about Vanessa, but about the workforce initiative and its expanding impact, because by then, the story wasn't about him kneeling in a hallway anymore. It was about a movement that had genuinely changed how tens of thousands of workers across the country were treated on the job. When asked, in that single interview, what he wanted people to remember most from everything that happened, Daniel paused for a long moment before answering. "I don't want people to remember the video," he said. "I want them to remember that the video wasn't actually about me. It was about a woman named Amara, who had every reason to feel powerless in that moment, and chose instead to stay standing. My part was small. Hers was everything." There's a moment, near the end of every story like this, when you realize the twist was never really about the billionaire or the scandal or the viral video that made headlines for a week. The real twist, the one that actually matters, is quieter than that. It's the realization that dignity was never something Vanessa had the power to take from Amara in that hallway, no matter how hard she tried. It's the understanding that Daniel's wealth was never the thing that made him worthy of admiration. It was the promise he kept to a 9-year-old version of himself who once watched his mother get treated like she didn't matter, and decided, quietly, without ever needing applause for it, that he would spend his life making sure fewer people had to feel that way. And it's the truth, maybe the most important one in this whole story, that real strength rarely announces itself. It doesn't come from riding crops or reputations or $11 billion empires. It comes from a young woman pressed against a wall, shaking, choosing not to run, because somewhere inside her, a mother's voice from a small kitchen in rural Georgia was telling her to stand up straight, to never let anyone make her feel small, even when every part of her wanted to disappear. If there's a lesson in this story, it's this. The people who walk past cruelty and the people who kneel down beside its victims are not separated by money, or power, or status. They're separated by character, by the choices we make in the 60 seconds when no one would blame us for looking away. Daniel Whitfield had every reason that night to protect his wedding, his image, his carefully built empire. Instead, he protected a stranger, because somewhere underneath the $11 billion, he never stopped being the boy who couldn't protect his mother, and refused to let another child grow up carrying that same helplessness. That's the story worth remembering. Not the scandal. Not the viral video. The choice. Made in an instant by a man who had everything to lose and chose, without hesitation, to do the right thing anyway. If this story moved you the way it moved me while writing it, do me a favor. Hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like this one. Subscribe if you're new here because we share stories just like this every single week. Stories about second chances, about quiet courage, about the kind of people who choose kindness even when nobody's watching, and sometimes even when everybody is. And if you know someone who needs a reminder today that standing up for someone else always matters, no matter how small the moment feels, share this with them. Thank you for staying until the end. I'll see you in the next story.